before the Empire cast its shadow across 1,000 worlds, before Darth Sidious whispered poison into the ears of senators, before the Clone Wars ravaged the galaxy, there existed a Sith Lord whose name has been erased from history, a scientist, a visionary, a failure. In the twilight years of the Old Republic, when the Jedi believed the Sith extinct and peace seemed eternal, two apprentices served one master in secret. This was heresy. This was betrayal. This violated the most sacred law of the Sith, the rule of two established by Darth Bane a millennium before. Two there should be, no more, no less. One to embody power, the other to crave it. But Darth Tenebrous, master of mathematics and dark prophecy, played a deeper game. He trained them in shadow, pitting genius against cunning, science against politics, never revealing to either that the other existed. One apprentice would claim the title of Dark Lord, the other would die in obscurity, his very existence forgotten. Darth Venamis believed he was chosen, believed his mastery of life itself, his power over the microscopic foundations of the Force, made him worthy. He created living weapons from nothing. He manipulated the very building blocks of existence. But ambition means nothing without strength. Knowledge means nothing without power. When the truth emerged, when he discovered the deception, Venamis made a choice that sealed his fate. He challenged the one who had already won, and in that confrontation, in the sterile laboratories where he would spend his final years, he learned that death is not the end. Sometimes it is only the beginning of torment. Tonight we journey into the forgotten tragedy of Darth Venamis, a brilliant Sith scientist whose ambition led him into a nightmare worse than death itself. This is a tale of betrayal, experimentation, and the horrifying price of seeking power in the Sith Order. Now, here is something interesting. Around 62% of you watching right now have not yet subscribed. If you are enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars legends, hitting that subscribe button truly helps this channel grow and brings you more stories like this. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Drop a comment below, because connecting with you all makes this journey so much more meaningful. So now, dim those lights. Get comfortable under your blanket, maybe turn on a fan for that perfect ambient sound, and let us drift together into this dark chapter of galactic history. Our story begins approximately 67 years before the Battle of Yavin, in an age when the Republic still dreamed of eternal peace. The galaxy knew nothing of the shadow that moved beneath its foundations. For 1,000 years, the Sith had followed the rule of two, existing in absolute secrecy, passing power from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain of betrayal and ascension. On a nameless moon orbiting a dying red giant in the Outer Rim, far beyond the reach of Republic authority and Jedi observation, there stood a facility that official records insisted did not exist. The structures were built into ancient volcanic rock, carved from obsidian cliffs that absorbed all light and warmth. Inside these black stone corridors, the air hummed with dark side energy so concentrated it could be felt like pressure against the skin. This was one of several hidden academies maintained by Darth Tenebrous, a Bith Sith Lord, whose mathematical genius had unlocked secrets of precognition and probability. Within these sterile laboratories, surrounded by containment fields that pulsed with sickly green luminescence, another Bith was shaped into a weapon. His name was Venamis. Where most Sith apprentices learned the brutal elegance of lightsaber combat or the subtle art of political manipulation, Venamis studied life itself. His training chambers were not combat arenas, but surgical theaters. Instead of practicing Form 7 against training remotes, he dissected Force-sensitive creatures, studying how midi-chlorians responded to pain, to death, to the touch of the dark side. The laboratories stretched deep into the moon's crust, level after level of research facilities. Transparent cylinders lined the walls, each containing specimens suspended in Bacta solution, their bodies twisted by failed experiments. Some had been human once. Others were alien species whose names Venamis no longer remembered. All were testaments to his growing mastery over the fundamental forces of life. His appearance reflected his species. Yellow skin stretched over an enlarged cranium that housed a brain capable of processing calculations at superhuman speed. Large black eyes missed no detail. His fingers were long and precise, equally comfortable holding a lightsaber or a scalpel. He wore robes of deep crimson, the color of fresh blood, marked with symbols of Sith alchemy. Venamis had trained under Tenebrous for over 2 decades. He had mastered techniques that most Sith considered theoretical, impossible, or too dangerous to attempt. He could manipulate midi-chlorians directly, increasing or decreasing force sensitivity in living subjects. He had created artificial force sensitives, beings engineered from genetic material and dark side rituals. His experiments pushed boundaries that even ancient Sith lords had feared to approach. And he believed, with absolute certainty, that he was Tenebrous's only apprentice, that he was chosen, that upon his master's death he would ascend to become the Dark Lord of the Sith. He had no idea that everything he believed was a carefully calculated lie, that somewhere else in the galaxy another apprentice existed, a moon named Higo Damask, who would become known as Darth Plagueis the Wise. The betrayal, when it came, would shatter everything Venamis thought he knew. But that revelation still lay years in the future. For now, in his laboratories on that forgotten moon, he continued his work, confident in his destiny, blind to the truth that would destroy him. Darth Tenebrous was not like other Sith lords, where predecessors had relied on raw power and intimidation. He approached the dark side as a grand equation waiting to be solved. A Bith like Venamis, his cranium was even larger, containing a mind that could calculate probabilities across multiple timelines simultaneously. He had spent centuries refining a philosophy that marriage between science and the Force was the future of Sith dominance. Their first lesson took place in a chamber carved from pure cortosis, a mineral that could short-circuit lightsabers. The walls were inscribed with mathematical formulas, each one representing a different application of Force theory. Tenebrous stood before a holographic display showing the structure of a midi-chlorian, that microscopic organism living symbiotically within the cells of all living beings, the bridge between life and the Force itself. Power without understanding is the flaw that destroyed the old Sith Empire, Tenebrous explained, his voice carrying the precise cadence of someone who measured every word. They summoned force storms without comprehending the energy dynamics. They raised armies of the dead without understanding cellular decay. They were children playing with weapons they could not control. Venamis absorbed every word with the hunger of someone who had finally found purpose. Before Tenebrous discovered him on Clactor as Evan, he had been a promising biologist, someone whose research into genetic manipulation had drawn attention from the Republic Science Council. But Venamis had questions that polite society refused to answer. What were the limits of life? Could consciousness be transferred? Could force sensitivity be created artificially? The Jedi called such inquiries heresy. Tenebrous called them the beginning of wisdom. The training was unlike anything traditional Sith pedagogy would have recognized. While ancient Sith lords threw their apprentices into combat to forge them through survival, Tenebrous assigned research papers. While Darth Bane had forced his apprentice to endure Force lightning until she could withstand it, Tenebrous had Venamis calculate the exact voltage and amperage required to stimulate midi-chlorian response without causing permanent cellular damage. They studied the work of Darth Plagueis the Wise, though Venamis did not yet know that name belonged to his rival. Tenebrous shared carefully edited holocrons detailing experiments in life creation, midi-chlorian manipulation, and the theoretical foundations of immortality. Venamis learned that midi-chlorians were not merely indicators of force potential, but active participants in the relationship between living beings and the cosmic force. On a frigid moon, where the atmosphere was mostly nitrogen, Tenebris taught Venamis the art of force healing by having him repair increasingly complex organisms. They began with simple bacteria, learning to accelerate cellular division and repair genetic damage. Then insects, with their primitive nervous systems. Then rodents, where Venamis learned to mend broken bones and torn organs by directing midi-chlorians to the site of injury. The lesson that changed everything came during Venamis's 5th year of training. Tenebris presented him with a dying Twi'lek, a slave purchased from Hutt space, her body riddled with a degenerative disease that was slowly shutting down her organs. Venamis was instructed to save her using only the Force, no medical technology permitted. For 3 days and nights, Venamis worked without rest. He could feel the midi-chlorians in her cells, sluggish and unresponsive, as if the disease had severed their connection to the Force itself. He tried conventional force healing, pouring energy into her body, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The energy dissipated faster than he could supply it. On the 4th day, exhausted and desperate, Venamis tried something different. Instead of adding energy, he attempted to reprogram the midi-chlorians themselves, altering their function at a molecular level. He had no idea if it would work. The theory existed in ancient texts, but no modern Sith had successfully replicated it. The Twi'lek convulsed once violently, then went completely still. Venamis thought he had killed her. Then her eyes opened. The disease was gone, eradicated at the cellular level. The midi-chlorians in her body fundamentally altered to resist the pathogen. She lived for another 6 months before Tenebris deemed her useful for a different experiment. That success opened doors Venamis had not known existed. If midi-chlorians could be reprogrammed, what else was possible? Could they be inserted into non-force sensitive beings? Could entirely new life forms be created from raw biological material and force energy? Could death itself be reversed by restoring midi-chlorian function to dead tissue? Tenebris encouraged these questions. In fact, he seemed to have been waiting for Venamis to ask them. The Master provided resources that must have cost fortunes to acquire. Live subjects from the galactic underworld, beings no one would miss. Advanced laboratory equipment decades ahead of Republic technology. Ancient Sith texts describing experiments so horrific that even hardened dark side practitioners had hesitated to replicate them. The relationship between master and apprentice deepened into something almost resembling collaboration. Both were Bith. Both valued intellectual rigor over emotional indulgence. They could work in companionable silence for days, each absorbed in separate calculations, occasionally sharing observations. Tenebris would explain his precognition techniques, how he used mathematics to predict future events by analyzing probability waves in the Force. Venamis would demonstrate his latest breakthrough in cellular manipulation. But there were boundaries Tenebris never crossed. Questions he deflected, absences he refused to explain. Sometimes he would leave for months without warning, returning with new knowledge, but no explanation of where he had been. Venamis noticed but convinced himself it was normal. Masters had secrets. That was the way of the Sith. The combat training, when it happened, was almost an afterthought. Tenebris believed lightsaber dueling was a dying art, made obsolete by the Jedi's pacifism and the Sith's need for secrecy. Still, Venamis learned Form 2, Makashi, the dueling form built on precision rather than power. It suited his analytical mind. Every strike was a geometric problem. Every defense was calculated angles and leverage. He would never be a warrior like the ancient Sith Lords, but he became proficient enough to defend himself. What Venamis excelled at was the creation of life. By his 15th year of training, he had successfully created his first fully functional force-sensitive organism. It was small, no larger than a human hand, something between a reptile and an insect, but it could sense emotions through the Force. It responded to commands delivered telepathically, and when Venamis killed it to study its biology, he found its cells packed with midi-chlorians at a concentration that rivaled Jedi Masters. Tenebris observed the dissection with what might have been pride, though the Bith face was difficult to read. "You have surpassed my expectations," he said simply. "You may be ready for the next phase." The next phase involved scaling up. Venamis began working with humanoid subjects, attempting to increase their Force sensitivity through direct midi-chlorian manipulation. The failures were numerous and grotesque. Bodies rejected the foreign midi-chlorians, immune systems attacking them as invaders. Subjects died in agony as their cells tore themselves apart. Others survived physically but lost their minds, driven insane by sudden overwhelming sensory input from the Force. But slowly, painfully, Venamis refined the process. He learned that midi-chlorians had to be introduced gradually, allowing the body to adapt. He discovered that certain genetic markers predicted successful integration. He developed serums and rituals that increased success rates from 5% to nearly 40%. By the time 2 decades had passed, Venamis commanded a small force of artificially enhanced Force sensitives. They were not as powerful as naturally born Force users, but they were loyal, conditioned through both science and Sith alchemy to obey his commands without question. He called them his chosen, though they were really just successful experiments that had survived the process. Tenebris watched this army grow with apparent satisfaction. He never interfered, never critiqued, only observed and occasionally offered suggestions. Venamis interpreted this as approval, as confirmation that he was fulfilling his destiny as the heir to Tenebris's legacy. What Venamis did not know, could not have known, was that every success he achieved was being recorded and analyzed by his master. That every technique he developed would eventually be stolen and improved upon. That Tenebris viewed him not as an apprentice but as a proof of concept, a test subject who happened to be intelligent enough to conduct experiments on himself and others. The rule of 2 demanded that an apprentice eventually surpass and kill their master. Tenebris had calculated that Venamis would never be strong enough to do so. The Bith scientist had power, yes, a knowledge that could reshape the galaxy, but he lacked the killer instinct, the pure, ruthless ambition that defined true Sith Lords. He was too thoughtful, too methodical, too bound by scientific ethics, even when he thought he had abandoned them. Somewhere else in the galaxy, Tenebris had another apprentice who possessed what Venamis lacked. A Muun with centuries of patience, with political connections spanning sectors, with the cold calculation required to murder his own master when the time was right. Plagueis was everything Venamis was not, and Venamis was everything Plagueis was not. Tenebris intended to see which approach would prove superior, science or politics, Force manipulation or galactic manipulation. The student who could create life or the student who could take it without hesitation. But these thoughts never entered Venamis's mind as he worked in his laboratories, surrounded by his creations, confident in his master's favor. He believed himself chosen, special, the culmination of Sith evolution. The betrayal, when it came, would be absolute. The first crack in Venamis's certainty appeared as a financial discrepancy. He had been reviewing resource allocations for his latest project when he noticed funds being diverted through shell accounts he had never seen before. Substantial amounts, enough to fund an operation equal in scope to his own laboratories. When he traced the accounts, they led to dead ends, corporations that existed only on datapads, registered on worlds he had never visited. Venamis told himself there were logical explanations. Tenebris had other projects, other research priorities. The Sith operated in secrecy, maintaining multiple identities and hidden assets. This was normal operational security. But the doubt, once planted, grew like a virus in his analytical mind. He began paying attention to things he had previously dismissed. Tenebrus's unexplained absences were not random. They followed a pattern, occurring roughly every 6 weeks, lasting between 10 and 30 days. When the master returned, he often carried new knowledge, techniques that seemed to have been refined through practice rather than theory. During one absence, Venamis made a decision that violated every protocol of Sith apprenticeship. He hacked into Tenebrus's private communications network. The encryption was formidable, mathematical algorithms that would have defeated Republic intelligence agencies. But Venamis had been trained by the man who created those algorithms. He knew how Tenebrus thought, could anticipate the logic behind each security layer. What he found shattered his world. Encrypted messages to someone referred to only as the Muon Project, discussions of political maneuvering in the banking clan, references to a public-facing operation that contrasted with Venamis's own contingency research, and most damning, a single message that read simply, "Both experiments proceed as calculated. We shall see which proves more useful when the time comes." Venamis sat in darkness for hours after reading those words, his enhanced Bith brain processing implications faster than he could emotionally accept them. Experiments, not apprentices, not heirs, experiments, plural, which meant there was another, someone Tenebrus considered equal to him, or perhaps even superior, given the designation of public-facing versus contingency. The rage came slowly, building like pressure behind a dam. Venamis was not prone to emotional outbursts. His scientific training had taught him to observe, analyze, respond with calculation rather than impulse. But this was different. This touched something primal, a sense of betrayal that transcended logic. He had given Tenebrus 2 decades, 20 years of absolute loyalty, of pushing ethical boundaries he would never have crossed for anyone else. He had created life and destroyed it, had tortured subjects in the name of research, had abandoned every principle he once held, all because he believed it was for a greater purpose, that he was special, chosen to continue a legacy stretching back 1,000 years. And he was a contingency, a backup plan. Insurance in case the real apprentice failed. Venamis began investigating with the same methodical approach he applied to his experiments. He could not confront Tenebrus directly. The master would either lie convincingly or kill him for the insubordination. Instead, he gathered data. He traced financial records through layers of corporate fronts. He monitored Tenebrus's communications, learning to decrypt them in real time. He used the Force to sense emotional patterns, detecting when his master was lying or concealing information. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope. Tenebrus had been training another apprentice for decades, possibly longer than Venamis himself. The Manu was named Hego Damask, a banking executive whose wealth and influence gave him access to power structures that no laboratory scientist could ever touch. Where Venamis manipulated cells, Damask manipulated governments. Where Venamis created artificial force sensitives, Damask created political coalitions. They had never met. Tenebrus had kept them completely separate, probably assuming neither would discover the other's existence until he decided to reveal it. The master had violated the rule of 2 so fundamentally that even other Sith Lords would have considered it heresy. 2 apprentices serving one master was not just forbidden by tradition, it was a strategic nightmare, guaranteed to create conflict and weaken the Sith through internal division. Unless that was precisely what Tenebrus wanted. Venamis realized his master was conducting an experiment on a scale he had never imagined, not just scientific research, but a test of Sith philosophy itself. Which approach would prove superior in the modern galaxy? The old way of force mastery and mystical power, or the new way of political influence and economic control? Tenebrus was betting on both, seeing which horse would win the race. The discovery brought a bitter clarity. Venamis understood now why Tenebrus had always been emotionally distant. why he treated their relationship as a professional collaboration rather than the intense bond between master and apprentice described in Sith texts. Because it was a professional relationship, a researcher and his test subject. But understanding did not equal acceptance. Venamis had a choice to make. He could continue as before, pretending ignorance, hoping to eventually prove himself worthy. He could abandon the Sith entirely, disappear into the galaxy with his knowledge and his creations. Or he could fight for what he believed was rightfully his. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Venamis had invested too much to walk away. His entire adult life had been spent pursuing Sith knowledge, pushing boundaries, becoming something more than the cautious biologist he had been. And on a fundamental level, he believed his approach was correct. Science was the future. Politics was temporary, but mastery over life itself was eternal. If Tenebrous would not recognize his superiority, then the moon would have to. There could only be one Dark Lord of the Sith. The rule of two demanded it, and Venamis intended to be the one who survived. He began preparing in secret, never letting Tenebrous suspect that his carefully constructed deception had been uncovered. Venamis continued his research with renewed intensity, but now every experiment had a dual purpose. He was not just advancing Sith science, he was building weapons for the war he knew was coming. His chosen were trained more rigorously, pushed harder, enhanced beyond previous limits. Venamis developed techniques to boost their force sensitivity even further, accepting higher failure rates in exchange for greater power among survivors. He established backup facilities Tenebrous did not know about, hidden laboratories where he could continue his work even if his main base was compromised. And he studied everything he could learn about Damask. The Mud's public life was easy to research. Damask Holdings was one of the galaxy's largest financial institutions, with investments spanning from core worlds to wild space. Damask himself was known as a brilliant but ruthless businessman, someone who had accumulated wealth through strategic acquisitions and hostile takeovers. But the private life was more difficult to access. Damask maintained multiple residences, traveled constantly, and was protected by security that rivaled government officials. Venamis managed to acquire surveillance footage from a Coruscant charity gala, watched the tall Moan move through crowds with predatory grace. His face was elegant in the way Moan features could be, all angles and refinement. His eyes, when they turned toward the camera, held something ancient and cold. Looking at that face, Venamis felt the first tremor of doubt. This was not some politician playing at darkness. This was a being who had fully embraced the Sith path, who wore his public persona like clothing he could discard at will. Whatever Venamis had been expecting, it was not this. But he had gone too far to turn back. The discovery had changed everything. Even if he wanted to continue as before, the knowledge would poison every interaction with Tenebrous. The Master would eventually notice the change, the new tension, the questions behind his apprentice's eyes. No, there was only one path forward. Venamis would continue his work, perfect his creations, and wait. Eventually, Tenebrous would die. All beings did, even Sith Lords. And when that happened, when the moment came to claim the title, Venamis would be ready to face whatever the Munin had become. He did not have to wait long. 6 months after his discovery, word reached him through Sith communication channels. Tenebrous was dead, killed during a mining inspection on Beldemnik. The official story was an accident, a cave-in caused by unstable geology. The body had been recovered, identified, cremated according to Sith custom. Venamis did not believe in accidents. Not when Sith succession was involved. Not when another apprentice existed who would benefit from the Master's death. Damask had made his move, claimed his prize. He had taken the title that should have been Venamis's by right of being first, by right of superior knowledge, by right of 2 decades spent in absolute service. The rage that had been building for months found its release. Venamis sent a message through encrypted channels, one he knew would reach the being now calling himself Darth Plagueis. The words were simple, stripped of all pretense. "I am Venamis, first apprentice of Tenebris in the true Sith arts. You are a pretender who claims what you did not earn. I challenge your right to the title of Dark Lord. Meet me, or be forever known as a coward who stole his power rather than proving it." The response came within hours, a single sentence delivered with such casual dismissal that it stung worse than any insult could have. "I have been expecting you. Failed experiment. Come to sojourn. I will be waiting." The years between discovery and confrontation were not wasted. Venamis understood that rage alone would not defeat a Sith Lord who had successfully killed his own master. He needed advantages, weapons that Plagueis would not anticipate, and so he retreated into his laboratories and pushed his research into territories even Tenebris had considered too dangerous to explore. The core of his work remained midi-chlorian manipulation, but the applications grew darker. Where previously he had attempted to create force-sensitive beings who could think and reason, now he focused on obedience above all else. His new subjects were stripped of personality during the enhancement process, their minds wiped clean and reprogrammed with a single imperative: serve Venamis, destroy his enemies. The procedures grew more extreme. Venamis began using Sith alchemy alongside his scientific techniques, blending technology with dark side rituals that dated back to the ancient empire. He inscribed his laboratory floors with symbols of power, performed experiments during specific astronomical alignments, fed his subjects diets laced with alchemical compounds that made their bodies more receptive to force energy. The failure rate was catastrophic. For every successful enhancement, a dozen subjects died in ways that haunted even Venamis's nightmares. Bodies that tore themselves apart from the inside as incompatible midi-chlorians waged war at the cellular level. Minds that shattered under the weight of sudden force sensitivity, leaving behind screaming husks that had to be euthanized. Mutations so severe that the results could barely be classified as living, twisted things that expired within hours, despite his best efforts to stabilize them. But the successes, when they came, were extraordinary. Venamis created beings that could sense force users from kilometers away, hunting them with predatory single-mindedness. He engineered servants whose midi-chlorian counts approached those of Jedi Council members, though their power was focused and narrow rather than versatile. He bred creatures specifically designed to resist lightsabers, their hides toughened through alchemical processes that made them nearly impervious to energy blades. His main facility on the ice world expanded into a complex that sprawled across kilometers of frozen wasteland. Above ground, it appeared to be a derelict mining operation, abandoned decades ago and of no interest to anyone. Below the surface, it was a cathedral of dark science. Dozens of laboratories, each dedicated to specific aspects of his research, containment chambers, where his creations were housed, trained, prepared for the war he knew was inevitable. Venamis walked those corridors at all hours, inspecting his army, refining techniques, pushing himself and his subjects to their limits. Sleep became optional, replaced by meditation that allowed his body to rest while his mind continued working. He lost weight, his already thin bith frame becoming almost skeletal. His eyes, large and dark, developed a feverish intensity that made even his own creations uneasy in his presence. He kidnapped force-sensitive beings from across the Outer Rim, targets chosen for their lack of connections, people no one would miss. Street orphans with latent abilities, failed Jedi initiates who had been sent back to their families. Criminals with trace force sensitivity who used their gifts for petty theft and manipulation. All of them vanished into Venamis's facilities, raw material for his experiments. Some he attempted to enhance further, pushing their natural abilities beyond safe limits. Others he studied to understand why their force sensitivity had failed to develop properly, seeking ways to correct those deficiencies in his artificial creations. A few, those with particularly strong wills, he kept as test subjects for torture techniques, learning how different species responded to pain, how their connection to the force fluctuated under stress. The dark side grew thick in those facilities, concentrated by years of suffering and death. Venamis could feel it like a physical presence, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult. Lesser beings reported hallucinations after spending too long in the deeper levels, visions of the subjects who had died there, echoes of agony impressed into the very stone. But Venamis paid no attention to such concerns. He had moved beyond simple morality, beyond the weak ethics that limited lesser scientists. His work was not cruel, it was necessary. Every death brought him closer to perfection. Every failure taught him what to avoid in the next iteration. The suffering of hundreds would ensure his victory over the Murran, and that victory would prove the superiority of the scientific approach to the Sith. His most ambitious project began in the 3rd year after Tenebrous' death. Venamis attempted to create a being from nothing, using only raw biological material and force energy. The theoretical foundation came from ancient texts describing Sith lords who had generated life through pure will. But those accounts were vague, more mythology than instruction manual. Venamis approached it systematically. He began with single cells, attempting to imbue them with midi-chlorians and spark them into division through force manipulation. Early attempts simply died, the cells unable to sustain the energy. He refined the process, using growth medium enriched with compounds that stabilized the midi-chlorian bonding. Slowly, painfully, he achieved cellular division, then tissue growth, then the formation of primitive organs. The first complete organism he created was small and pathetic, a twisted thing that barely qualified as alive. It survived for 3 days before its malformed organs failed, but it had a rudimentary nervous system. It responded to stimuli, and when Venamis examined its cells under magnification, he found midi-chlorians artificially created and stable. He had done it. He had created life from nothing, crossed a threshold that even the Jedi would insist was impossible. The being that resulted was useless, too damaged to serve any function, but it proved the concept. Given time and resources, Venamis could refine the technique, create functional organisms, perhaps even design them with specific capabilities built into their genetic code. But time was running short. Plagueis had claimed the Sith title, had been operating openly in galactic politics for years. If Venamis delayed much longer, the Murran's power base would become unassailable. Already he controlled vast wealth, influenced senators and corporate leaders, had built a network that spanned sectors. The window for challenging him was closing. Venamis made his final preparations. He selected his 20 most successful creations, the chosen who had survived all enhancements and proven themselves capable of independent action. He armed them with weapons designed to counter force users, cortosis blades that could short-circuit lightsabers, slug throwers whose projectiles could not be deflected with the force, poisons that targeted midi-chlorians directly. His laboratories were set to automated protocols, experiments continuing even in his absence. He established dead man switches, communications that would alert certain underworld contacts if he failed to check in regularly. His research data was backed up across multiple secure locations, encrypted beyond even Republic military standards. And then he sent his challenge to Plagueis, the message that would set events in motion that could not be stopped. As he waited for the response, standing in his command center surrounded by instruments displaying the vital signs of 200 test subjects, Venamis felt something he had not experienced in years. Fear, not of death. Death was merely a biological process, one he had studied extensively and learned to partially reverse. but fear of irrelevance, of discovering that despite all his work, all his sacrifices, all his terrible experiments and discarded ethics, he was still somehow inferior to a politician who played the game differently. That fear transformed into determination. He would prove himself. He would defeat Plagueis in combat, take the title of Dark Lord, and show the galaxy that science was the true path to Sith supremacy. Everything he had done, every life he had taken or destroyed, would be justified by that victory. The response from Plagueis came, cold, dismissive, confident, an invitation to sojourn, a world Venamis had never heard of, probably one of the Muon's private holdings, a place where Plagueis would have every advantage, surrounded by his own resources and security. It did not matter. Venamis loaded his ship with weapons, equipment, and his 20 chosen. The journey would take days through hyperspace, time he spent in meditation, drawing on the dark side, preparing himself mentally and spiritually for the confrontation that would determine his fate. He did not know, could not have known, that he was traveling toward his doom, that Plagueis had spent those same years perfecting, not science but power itself, raw dark side mastery that dwarfed anything Venamis had achieved. That the Muon was not concerned about this challenge, because he had been aware of Venamis's existence from the beginning, had monitored his progress through Tenebrous' reports, had always known this confrontation would come. Plagueis was not preparing for battle. He was preparing his laboratories, the facilities where he would imprison and study the fool who thought scientific knowledge could substitute for true Sith strength. Between the revelation of Plagueis' existence and the inevitable confrontation, Venamis spent 3 years constructing an empire in the shadows. He understood that raw force power alone would not guarantee victory. The Sith had survived a millennium through careful planning, through networks of influence that operated independently of any single individual. If he was to challenge a being who controlled one of the galaxy's largest financial institutions, he needed comparable resources. His first priority was funding. The laboratories consumed credits at an alarming rate, and Tenebrous' death had severed his access to the Master's accounts. Venamis turned to methods that would have horrified his younger self, but now seemed merely practical. He sold his services to crime syndicates, offering genetic modifications that enhanced strength, reflexes, and aggression. Hot cartels paid enormous sums for slaves, modified to be more obedient, more productive, more willing to endure harsh conditions without complaint. The ethical implications barely registered anymore. These were not people to Venamis. They were economic transactions, sources of funding that allowed him to continue more important work. He performed the modifications with clinical detachment, adjusted brain chemistry here, increased pain tolerance there, deleted inconvenient personality traits with the precision of a surgeon removing tumors. Through these underworld connections, he established a network of informants spanning dozens of systems, pirates who reported ship movements, corrupt officials who provided advance warning of Republic investigations, information brokers who traded in secrets and sold them to the highest bidder. Venamis paid well and killed those who betrayed him, earning a reputation as someone to be feared even among beings who dealt in violence professionally. His resource acquisition extended to artifacts and knowledge. Venamis raided tombs on Korriban under cover of archaeological expeditions, stealing Sith holocrons that contained techniques the modern order had forgotten. He purchased stolen Jedi texts from black market dealers, studying their approach to force healing to improve his own manipulation techniques. Ancient scrolls describing Sith alchemy, Rakatan force sciences, even rumors of celestial technology, all found their way to his laboratories. The facilities themselves expanded beyond the ice world. Venamis established secondary bases on remote asteroids, abandoned space stations, and uninhabited moons. Each location served a specific purpose. One specialized in combat training for his chosen, another focused on toxin development, creating poisons that targeted midi-chlorians directly. A third housed his most dangerous experiments, subjects too unstable to keep near population centers. He developed a system of shell corporations to legitimize his operations. On paper, he was the director of several biotech research firms investigating treatments for genetic diseases. The Republic granted him research permits. Medical journals published his sanitized findings. He even received a commendation from a core world senator for breakthrough work in regenerative medicine. The irony did not escape him. While Plagueis operated openly as a banker, using legitimate business to mask Sith activities, Venamis used legitimate science to mask his dark side experiments. They were mirror images, two approaches to the same goal of hidden influence. His chosen evolved from simple force-sensitive servants into a proper military force. Venamis organized them into squads, each with specialized capabilities. Some were hunters, trained to track force users across continents through the force alone. Others were assassins, enhanced for stealth and precision strikes. A few were brutes, massive beings whose bodies had been modified for raw combat power at the expense of intelligence and subtlety. Training them required facilities that could withstand significant damage. Venamis constructed combat arenas in abandoned mines, chambers where his chosen fought captured criminals to the death while he observed and took notes. He recorded everything, analyzing fighting styles, measuring force expenditure during combat, identifying weaknesses in his enhancement procedures. The psychological conditioning was as important as the physical modifications. Venamis used a combination of Sith mind technique and behavioral programming to ensure absolute loyalty. His subjects were conditioned to experience euphoria when following orders, agony when considering disobedience. Their sense of identity was stripped away and rebuilt around service to their creator. They did not have names, only designations. They did not have desires beyond fulfilling their function. Some retained enough personality to question their existence during rare moments of clarity. Venamis killed those immediately. Hesitation was weakness. Doubt was failure. His chosen needed to be weapons, nothing more. He tested them in real combat situations, sending them to eliminate targets across the Outer Rim. Minor Force users who had escaped Jedi notice. Dark side adepts operating in isolation. Even a few disgraced Jedi who had left the Order and tried to disappear into the galactic underworld. Each mission provided data, revealed flaws in training or enhancement, allowed Venamis to refine his techniques for the next generation. The death toll from his experiments climbed into the thousands. Beings who volunteered, thinking they were participating in legitimate medical research. Criminals sold to him by corrupt officials. Refugees who vanished from processing centers, all of them ending up in containment tanks, or dissection tables, or cremation furnaces. Venamis kept meticulous records. Every subject had a file documenting their species, age, initial midi-chlorian count, procedures performed, and final disposition. The files filled data cores, terabytes of information representing years of systematic experimentation. He told himself this was science, that documentation was what separated him from common murderers. The records would justify everything once he proved the superiority of his approach. His personal capabilities advanced as well. Venamis had always been more scientist than warrior, but he recognized that intellectual superiority meant nothing if he could not defend himself. He spent hours each day in force training, pushing his abilities beyond comfortable limits. Telekinesis until blood vessels burst in his eyes, force lightning until his fingers were permanently scarred. Meditation so deep he barely registered when his body's life support systems began failing. The dark side responded to his intensity, granting power in exchange for his suffering and the suffering he inflicted on others. Venamis could feel himself changing, becoming something more than the cautious biologist Tenebrous had recruited decades ago. His connection to the Force deepened, allowing him to sense life across kilometers, to manipulate living tissue from a distance, to inflict pain with a thought. But there were costs beyond the physical. Venamis noticed gaps in his memory, entire days that vanished as if they had never existed. His emotional range narrowed, everything except anger and ambition becoming muted and distant. He experienced moments of dissociation, looking at his own hands and briefly not recognizing them as belonging to him. These symptoms concerned him from a medical perspective, but did not slow his work. He was transforming, evolving into something necessary for the challenge ahead. If that required sacrificing parts of himself, then so be it. The weak version of Venamis who had worried about ethics and consequences was dead. What remained was focused, powerful, and utterly committed to victory. His intelligence network eventually provided information on Plagueis that seemed almost too good to be true. The Moment maintained a private retreat on a world called Sojourn, far from Republic oversight. He traveled there regularly, often alone, using the isolation to conduct his own experiments. Security was present but not overwhelming. It was as close to vulnerable as a Sith Lord ever became. Venamis studied the intelligence obsessively, looking for traps or deceptions, but everything checked out. Multiple independent sources confirmed the location. Surveillance footage, though distant and grainy, showed the unmistakable tall figure of a moon arriving and departing. This was real. The realization settled over him like cold water. This was actually happening. After years of preparation, of building resources and power, of transforming himself into something capable of challenging a Dark Lord, the moment had arrived. He would travel to Sojourn, he would face Plagueis, and one of them would die. Venamis spent the final weeks before departure in frantic preparation. He reviewed every technique he had mastered, every advantage he possessed. His chosen were brought to peak readiness, fed stimulants that pushed their already enhanced abilities to dangerous levels. Equipment was packed, weapons loaded, contingency plans established for every scenario he could imagine. In quieter moments, usually deep in the sleep cycle when his facility was silent except for the hum of life support systems, Venamis allowed himself to wonder if he was making a mistake. Plagueis had killed Tenebris, a Sith Lord with centuries of experience. What made Venamis think he could succeed where his master had failed? But those doubts were brief, quickly buried under renewed determination. Tenebris had been old, perhaps complacent, and he had not possessed what Venamis now commanded, an army of Force-sensitive warriors, decades of research into midi-chlorian manipulation, weapons specifically designed to counter Sith combat techniques. Most importantly, the burning rage of someone who had been deceived, used, designated as nothing more than a contingency plan. That rage would carry him through. It had to, because the alternative, accepting that he was inferior, that all his work meant nothing against true Sith power, was unthinkable. Venamis boarded his ship for the journey to Sojourn with 20 of his chosen in tow. The vessel was modified for combat, bristling with weapons that violated multiple Republic regulations. Its holds contained equipment for every contingency, medical supplies for treating Force-inflicted wounds, scanning devices to detect ambushes, even a portable laboratory in case he needed to perform emergency enhancements on his servants. As the stars stretched into hyperspace, and the ship began its multi-day journey, Venamis sat alone in the meditation chamber he had installed in the main cabin. He reached out through the Force, trying to sense what awaited him at the destination, but all he felt was darkness, thick and oppressive, like trying to see through smoke. Plagueis was waiting, and whatever happened on Sojourn would determine not just Venamis's fate, but the future direction of the Sith themselves. Would they embrace science and systematic experimentation, or would they continue down the path of political manipulation and shadow control? Venamis intended to provide the answer with a lightsaber through the man's heart. The news of Tenebris's death, reached Venamis through encrypted channels, delivered in the cold bureaucratic language the Sith used for such announcements. Master deceased, successor designated. All assets to be transferred to the new Dark Lord. The message was brief, clinical, offering no details about how or why their master had died. Venamis received the transmission in his primary laboratory, surrounded by tanks containing his latest experiments. For a long moment, he simply stared at the holographic text, his enhanced Bith-brain processing implications faster than most beings could think. Tenebris was dead. After centuries of existence, the mathematical genius who had predicted probabilities decades into the future had somehow failed to predict his own demise. The official story emerged over the following days through underworld channels and carefully planted Republic news reports. Tenebris, operating under one of his many legitimate identities, had been conducting an inspection of mining operations on Baldemic. A cave-in, caused by unstable geological conditions, had killed him instantly. His body was recovered, identified through genetic records, and cremated according to his documented wishes. It was perfect, too perfect. The kind of accident that would satisfy Republic investigators, while hiding the truth from anyone not initiated into Sith affairs. Venamis knew immediately what had happened. Plagueis had made his move, killed their shared master, and claimed the title that should have been contested. The rule of two demanded that apprentice eventually surpass and slay master. It was the mechanism by which the Sith grew stronger with each generation, ensuring that only the most powerful survived to pass on their knowledge. Venamis had always known this confrontation would come eventually. What enraged him was that Plagueis had acted first, had seized the initiative while Venamis remained ignorant in his laboratories. He accessed Sith communication networks using protocols Tenebris had taught him, searching for any official acknowledgement of the succession. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Darth Plagueis was now recognized as Dark Lord of the Sith, heir to a lineage stretching back through Tenebris, through Bane, through centuries of shadow and secret power. No mention of Venamis, no acknowledgement that another apprentice existed. The erasure was complete and deliberate. Plagueis was declaring that Venamis did not matter, had never mattered, was not worthy of even being acknowledged as a rival. The insult cut deeper than any lightsaber could have. Venamis began his investigation immediately, dedicating resources to learning everything possible about the being who had stolen his destiny. The public face was easy to research. Ego Damask was famous in certain circles, a Mon banking executive whose financial acumen was legendary. Damask Holdings controlled assets across hundreds of systems, with investments in mining, manufacturing, technology, and real estate. Financial records painted a picture of aggressive expansion. Damask had built his empire through hostile takeovers and strategic acquisitions, buying distressed companies for fractions of their value and restructuring them into profitable enterprises. He was ruthless in business, known for destroying competitors and consolidating industries under his control. Senators sought his advice on economic policy. Corporate boards competed for his investment. But beneath that legitimate facade, Venamis detected patterns that revealed the Sith underneath. Damask's investments often benefited from convenient accidents, eliminating rival bidders. Politicians who opposed his interest developed sudden scandals or health problems. Regulations that would have limited his operations died in committee after key legislators changed their votes unexpectedly. The Mern was using wealth and political influence the way other Sith used the Force, as tools to reshape reality according to his will. Where ancient Sith lords had commanded armies and ruled through fear, Plagueis commanded markets and ruled through debt. It was brilliant, subtle, and perfectly suited to an age where the Republic believed the Sith extinct. Venamis obtained surveillance footage from various sources studying his rival's appearance and behavior. Plagueis was tall, even for a Mund, his elongated features somehow managing to convey both elegance and menace. He dressed in expensive but understated clothing, projecting wealth without ostentation. In public he was charming, articulate, quick, with a kind of self-deprecating humor that put others at ease while establishing dominance. But the eyes gave him away. When Plagueis thought no one was watching, when his guard dropped for a fraction of a second between meetings, his eyes held something ancient and hungry. This was not a politician playing at being Sith. This was a true Dark Lord who wore civilization like a costume. The more Venamis learned, the more his confidence wavered. Plagueis was not just wealthy and politically connected. He was genuinely powerful in the Force, trained by Tenebrous for far longer than Venamis himself. Reports from underworld sources spoke of demonstrations that defied explanation. A rival banker who had planned to testify against Damask Holdings in a Republic investigation suffered a stroke during his prepared testimony, clutching his chest and collapsing, despite being in perfect health hours before. A corporate executive who refused to sell his company to Damask fell from his penthouse balcony, the official ruling suicide despite no history of depression. These were not accidents. They were warnings, messages delivered through the Force to anyone paying attention. Plagueis was not hiding his power. He was demonstrating it, daring others to challenge him while maintaining plausible deniability. Venamis tried to calculate his chances of victory and kept arriving at uncomfortable conclusions. In a direct confrontation based purely on combat ability and Force mastery, Plagueis likely held the advantage. He had more training, more experience, more time spent refining his connection to the dark side. Tenebrous had clearly invested more resources in him, seeing him as the primary heir while Venamis was relegated to backup status. But Venamis had advantages Plagueis might not anticipate. His Force-sensitive warriors, designed specifically to hunt and kill Force users, his knowledge of midi-chlorian manipulation, techniques that could disrupt an opponent's connection to the Force at the cellular level, his willingness to use weapons and tactics that traditional Sith might consider beneath them. The question was whether those advantages would be enough to overcome the gap in raw power. Venamis spent weeks running simulations, calculating probabilities, trying to find scenarios where he emerged victorious. The mathematics were not encouraging. In direct combat, he lost 73% of projected encounters. Adding his chosen improved the odds to 61%, including surprise attacks. Environmental advantages and specialized weapons brought it to nearly even odds. Nearly even was not good enough, but it was better than nothing. The revelation of what had truly happened on Baldemic came from an unexpected source. One of Venamis's underworld contacts, a forger who specialized in creating false identities for criminals, had worked with someone claiming to have been present during Tenebrous's death. For the right price, this witness was willing to share details that had never made it into official reports. Venamis paid an obscene amount of credits for a meeting that lasted less than an hour. The witness was a human mining supervisor, clearly traumatized by whatever he had experienced. His story emerged in fragments, interrupted by long pauses and nervous glances at shadows. Tenebrous had arrived on Baldemnik with a Moon companion, both of them inspecting the mining operations personally. The supervisor had thought it odd that executives of their apparent rank would visit such a remote facility, but he knew better than to question corporate decisions. They had descended deep into the mine, examining geological formations and discussing something in a language he did not recognize. Then the ceiling collapsed, except it did not fall naturally. The supervisor swore he saw the Maul gesture, saw rocks respond to that gesture like they were obeying commands. Tenebrous had sensed the danger, tried to defend himself with similar impossible abilities, but he was too slow, or the Maul's was too fast. Tons of stone crushed the Bith, killing him almost instantly. What happened next still gave the supervisor nightmares. As Tenebrous died, something emerged from his body, a presence that had no physical form but could be felt like pressure in the air. It tried to enter the Moon, to force itself inside him, and the Moon resisted. pushing back with his own power, wrestling with this invisible force until it dissipated like smoke. Then the moon had calmly climbed out of the rubble, not a mark on him, and instructed the supervisor to report the cave-in as an accident. The supervisor had agreed immediately, instinctively understanding that refusal meant death. He had fled Baldemek as soon as possible and been running ever since, convinced that the moon would eventually find and silence him. Venamis paid the supervisor an additional sum to disappear permanently, then sat alone digesting the implications. Tenebris had attempted essence transfer, the ancient Sith technique of possessing another's body to achieve a form of immortality. He had tried to take over Plagueis at the moment of death, to continue his existence in a younger, stronger vessel. And Plagueis had stopped him, had resisted possession by a Sith Lord with centuries of experience, then killed that Lord and claimed his title. The feat was staggering, demonstrating both force mastery and strength of will that Venamis had to respect even as it terrified him. This revelation recontextualized everything. Tenebris had never intended either apprentice to truly succeed him. He had planned to possess the victor, to use their body to continue his own existence. Both Venamis and Plagueis had been groomed as potential vessels, their training designed to make them powerful enough to be worth possessing, but not so powerful they could resist. Plagueis had exceeded those parameters. He had become strong enough to reject his master's final gambit and emerge as a Dark Lord in his own right, which meant the moon was far more dangerous than Venamis had initially calculated. But understanding the danger did not change the fundamental situation. There could only be one Dark Lord. The title Plagueis claimed belonged to Venamis by right of being trained first, by right of understanding the true future of the Sith through science rather than politics. If the moon had killed Tenebris to take that title, then Venamis would simply have to kill Plagueis. He composed his challenge carefully, encoding it with Sith ciphers that ensured only the intended recipient could decrypt it. The message was simple and direct. Venamis identified himself, claimed his legitimacy as Tenebris's first apprentice, and demanded recognition or trial by combat. He made no threats, offered no insults, simply stated facts and awaited response. The reply came faster than expected, arriving within hours rather than days. Plagueis clearly monitored Sith communication channels constantly, alert for any challenge to his authority. But the response's content shocked Venamis more than its speed. "I have been expecting you. Failed experiment. Come to Sojourn. I will be waiting." Failed experiment. Plagueis had known about him all along. Known and dismissed him as insignificant, unworthy of concern. Tenebris must have shared information about both apprentices with each other, or at least Plagueis had known about Venamis, even if the reverse was not true until recently. The casual dismissal ignited rage that Venamis had been trying to control through meditation and calculation. This was not just about succession anymore, it was personal. Plagueis viewed him with contempt, as something beneath notice. That contempt would be his weakness. He would underestimate Venamis, expect easy victory, and in that moment of overconfidence, he would die. Venamis sent a brief confirmation and began final preparations. The journey to Sojourn would take days through hyperspace, time he spent in deep meditation, drawing on the dark side, preparing himself mentally for what awaited. He reviewed every technique he had mastered, every advantage he possessed, every possible scenario for how the confrontation might unfold. His chosen sensed his determination through the Force and responded with increased aggression in their training. They were extensions of his will, weapons he had forged over years of experimentation. When the moment came, they would fight and die for him without hesitation. As his ship emerged from hyperspace near Sojourn, Venamis felt the dark side thrumming through the planet below like a heartbeat. Plagueis had been here often, had saturated the location with his presence. This was his territory, his ground, chosen deliberately to give him every advantage. But Venamis had come too far to turn back now. He guided his ship toward the coordinates Plagueis had provided, toward the confrontation that would determine which vision of the Sith would prevail, science or politics. Midi-chlorian manipulation or galactic manipulation, the cautious researcher or the ruthless banker. Only one would leave Sojourn alive, and Venamis had dedicated everything to ensuring he would be that one. Sojourn revealed itself as the ship descended through the atmosphere, a world of red deserts and black volcanic rock formations that thrust toward the sky like broken teeth. Plagueis had chosen well. The planet was far from Republic trade routes, uninhabited except for his personal facilities, a place where screams would go unheard and battles would leave no witnesses. The coordinates led to a structure that looked ancient, though Venamis suspected it was newly constructed to appear that way. Black stone walls carved with symbols that predated the Republic, a courtyard open to the blood-colored sky, towers that served no obvious defensive purpose. It was a temple, or perhaps a mockery of one, built to honor dark side philosophies rather than any specific deity. Venamis's ship landed in the courtyard beside another vessel, sleek and expensive, unmistakably belonging to someone with Damask's resources. His chosen filed out behind him, 20 warriors enhanced beyond natural limits, their presence in the Force crackling like lightning preparing to strike. They formed a protective formation, scanning for threats, hands-on weapons designed to kill Force users. The air tasted of ozone and ash. Wind howled through the ancient architecture, carrying sounds that might have been natural or might have been something else. Venamis extended his senses, searching for Plagueis's presence, and found it immediately. The Mammon was inside the main structure, not hiding, radiating dark side energy with such intensity that it was almost a physical presence. They waited. The silence stretched, broken only by wind and the occasional click of cooling metal from the ships. Venamis refused to enter the structure first. This was Plagueis's game. His chosen ground. Let the Mun come to him. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, a figure emerged from the temple's main entrance. Tall, elegant, moving with predatory grace that belied his species' reputation for being frail. Darth Plagueis was more impressive in person than any surveillance footage had suggested. He wore dark robes that managed to look both expensive and practical, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority. His lightsaber hung at his belt, unignited but ready. His hands were empty, relaxed, conveying that he felt no threat from the 21 beings arrayed against him. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard without needing to be raised, each word precisely articulated. Venamis, you are smaller than I expected. Tenebris described you as his greatest achievement in biological manipulation. Looking at you now, I wonder if his standards were lower than I realized. The insult was calculated to provoke an emotional response. Venamis recognized the tactic and refused to take the bait. Instead, he stepped forward, leaving his chosen in position behind him, and spoke with equal coldness. I am the first apprentice Tenebris trained in the true Sith arts. I claim the title of Dark Lord by right of precedence and by right of superior knowledge. You are a politician who plays at being Sith while hiding behind banks and corporations. Plagueis laughed, genuine amusement lighting his alien features. Superior knowledge. You understand midi-chlorians the way a mechanic understands a speeder, knowing which parts to replace, but not why the machine functions. I understand the Force itself, the fundamental nature of reality. Your knowledge is memorization, mine is comprehension. Then you should comprehend that you are about to die. Oh, I have been anticipating this moment for years. Tenebris kept me informed of your progress. You see, he would share reports of your experiments, your successes and failures. He found it amusing, using one apprentice's work to educate the other. Every technique you developed, I learned and improved upon. Every mistake you made, I avoided. You have been my teacher, Venamis, though you never knew it." The revelation hit harder than Venamis had expected. Every breakthrough he thought was his own. Every advancement he had achieved in secret, Tenebris had been sharing with Plaguey. His entire research program had been compromised from the beginning, used to educate his rival. "Then you know what my chosen are capable of," Venamis said, gesturing to the warriors behind him. "You know they were designed specifically to hunt and kill Force users. Perhaps you should have learned humility along with my techniques." Plagueis' expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious but no less confident. "I know they are impressive experiments, better than Tenebris expected you could achieve. I also know they are failures. Artificial force sensitivity is inherently unstable, prone to burnout and degradation. Your chosen will not survive another year, even if I spare them today, which I will not." He raised one hand, almost casually, and force lightning erupted from his fingertips. Not the controlled bursts Venamis had seen in training, but torrents of electrical energy that lit the courtyard brighter than day. The lightning struck the nearest of Venamis's chosen, a being enhanced for combat strength and durability. It did not simply kill him, it obliterated him, reducing flesh and bone to ash in seconds. The attack continued, lightning arcing from one chosen to another, jumping between them like they were conductors in a circuit. Venamis tried to intervene, throwing up a force barrier to protect his creations, but Plagueis' power overwhelmed his defenses effortlessly. The barriers shattered. The lightning continued its terrible work. His chosen tried to fight back. They fired slug throwers, weapons whose projectiles could not be deflected with the force. They threw cortosis grenades, designed to disrupt force abilities. They charged with poison blades meant to target midi-chlorians. Nothing worked. Plagueis moved with inhuman speed, dodging projectiles, crushing grenades in midair with telekinesis, disarming attackers with gestures that sent them flying backward into walls with bone-breaking force. It was not a battle, it was a demonstration. Plagueis was showing Venamis the vast gulf between their abilities, proving that 2 decades of research and enhancement meant nothing against true Sith mastery. One by one, the chosen fell. Some died to lightning. Others had their necks snapped by invisible hands. A few simply collapsed as Plagueis crushed their internal organs through the force. Venamis watched his life's work destroyed in minutes. 20 years of experiments, countless subjects sacrificed to create these warriors, all of it rendered meaningless by a moon who had not even needed to ignite his lightsaber. The rage that had been building for years finally broke through his carefully maintained control. He attacked with everything he had, telekinesis hurling massive chunks of broken stone at Plagueis, force lightning of his own, weaker than the moon's, but still deadly. Midi-chlorian manipulation attempts, trying to disrupt his opponent's connection to the force at the cellular level. He even drew his lightsaber, the red blade humming as he charged forward with Makashi precision. Plagueis defended without apparent effort. Stones were deflected or caught and thrown back. Lightning was absorbed and redirected. The midi-chlorian attacks failed completely, unable to penetrate whatever defenses the moon had erected. And when their lightsabers finally met, the disparity in skill became painfully obvious. Venamis had trained in Form 2, the dueling style that emphasized efficiency and precision. He knew the angles, understood the geometry of combat, could calculate optimal strike patterns faster than most beings could think. But Plagueis moved like violence incarnated, his style incorporating elements from multiple forms, adapting instantly to counter each attack. The duel ranged across the courtyard, red blades leaving after images in the dusty air. Venamis tried every technique he knew, every trick Tenebris had taught him. He aimed for weak points, attempted feints and misdirection, used the force to enhance his speed beyond normal limits. Nothing worked. Plagueis was always one step ahead, his blade intercepting attacks before they completed, his counters forcing Venamis onto desperate defense. Blood began appearing on Venamis's robes, small cuts that accumulated into serious wounds. His left arm hung useless, tendons severed by a strike too fast to see. His right leg buckled from a slash that cut through muscle nearly to bone. Exhaustion crept in despite force-enhanced endurance, his body burning through energy faster than it could be replenished. In desperation, Venamis attempted his most dangerous technique, one he had only tested on subjects who had not survived the experience. He reached out through the force and tried to drain Plagueis's life energy directly, to pull the vitality from his cells and transfer it to his own body. For a moment, it worked. He felt the Muon's vast power, tasted the dark side energy that sustained him, began drawing it in. Then Plagueis reversed the technique. With surgical precision, he not only stopped the drain, but inverted it, pulling life force from Venamis instead. The sensation was indescribable, like having your soul torn out through every pore. Venamis screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the ancient stone walls. The draining stopped abruptly. Venamis collapsed to his knees, barely conscious, his lightsaber fallen from nerveless fingers. He looked up to see Plagueis standing over him, not even breathing hard, regarding him with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "You could have been useful," Plagueis said quietly. "If you had accepted your place, continued your research in service to the Sith rather than your own ambition. But you chose to challenge me, and the rule of two demands I respond appropriately." Venamis tried to speak, managed only a wet coughing sound. Blood filled his mouth, internal injuries from force attacks making breathing difficult. He gathered the last of his strength for one final attack, knowing it was futile but unable to simply accept defeat. Plagueis casually swatted aside the weak telekinetic push, then raised his hand. Force energy wrapped around Venamis like chains, lifting him into the air, holding him suspended and helpless. The Muon stepped closer, studying him the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen. "I am going to let you live, Venamis. Not out of mercy, but because you still have value. Your body holds secrets. I wish to understand. Your experiments, crude as they were, provide a foundation I can build upon, and most importantly, your suffering will fuel my own advancement in the dark side." Horror dawned in Venamis's eyes as he realized what was being promised. Not the clean death of a defeated warrior, but something worse. He would become what he had made others, a test subject, a resource to be exploited until nothing remained worth using. He tried to beg, tried to negotiate, tried to threaten. Nothing emerged but wordless sounds. Plagueis made a dismissive gesture and unconsciousness claimed him, darkness swallowing awareness like water closing over a drowning man's head. When Venamis woke, he was no longer on sojourn. The last thing he remembered clearly was Plagueis's face, the cold satisfaction in those ancient eyes. Everything after that was fragmented. Glimpses of being loaded onto a ship, of traveling through hyperspace, of arriving at a facility whose location he could not determine. He was in a containment field, suspended in energy that prevented movement while allowing full consciousness. The room around him was familiar in its design, a laboratory equipped for advanced biological research. But the equipment was more sophisticated than anything in his own facilities, and some of the devices he did not even recognize. Plagueis entered his field of vision, dressed now in a medical smock, looking for all the world like a legitimate researcher preparing to begin a day's work. He approached the containment field and studied Venamis with clinical interest. "Welcome to your new purpose," the Muon said pleasantly. "For the next few years you will contribute more to Sith science than you ever could have achieved independently. Your body will reveal its secrets, your techniques will be perfected, and your death, when it finally comes, will mean something." Venamis wanted to scream defiance. to curse his captor, to rage against the injustice. But the containment field prevented speech, allowed only the ability to watch and listen, as Plagueis explained exactly what was going to happen. The experiments would begin immediately. Midi-chlorian extraction, tissue sampling, consciousness transfer attempts, death and resurrection cycles. Everything Venamis had done to others would be done to him, refined by someone with greater knowledge and fewer scruples. He would experience his own techniques from the other side, would finally understand what his subjects had felt during those years in his laboratories. And there would be no escape, no rescue, no hope of mercy or reversal. There was only the future Plagueis described. Years of systematic torture disguised as research, ending eventually in permanent death when his usefulness expired. Venamis closed his eyes, seeking the comfort of unconsciousness again, but the containment field would not allow it. He was forced to remain aware as Plagueis began the first procedure, as instruments he had designed or similar versions pierced his flesh, as pain, unlike anything he had experienced before, consumed his entire existence. This was his reward for ambition. This was the price of challenging a true Sith Lord. This was the future he had earned through 2 decades of believing himself special, chosen, destined for greatness. The last coherent thought Venamis had before the pain overwhelmed everything else was bitter recognition. He had become exactly what he had made others, not a person but a resource, valuable only for what could be extracted before disposal. The irony would have been funny if it were not so perfectly, terribly complete. The facility existed somewhere in the outer rim, though Venamis never learned its exact location. Plagueis had constructed it specifically for experiments too dangerous or morally questionable even by Sith standards. The laboratories were state-of-the-art, equipped with technology decades ahead of Republic medical science. Some of the devices Venamis recognized from his own research. Others were completely foreign, suggesting Plagueis had access to knowledge sources Tenebris had never shared. Venamis's containment cell was a cylinder of transparent durasteel 3 meters in diameter. Energy fields at top and bottom held him suspended in the center, preventing movement while maintaining full sensory awareness. Life support systems monitored every biological function, adjusting automatically to keep him alive regardless of what procedures were performed. Medical droids stood dormant in alcoves, awaiting commands to administer treatments or collect samples. The first week was devoted to baseline measurements. Plagueis documented everything about Venamis's physiology before beginning modifications. Blood samples revealed midi-chlorian counts higher than most Jedi Knights. Tissue biopsies showed cellular structures adapted to channel force energy efficiently. Brain scans mapped neural pathways enhanced through decades of dark side use. Every organ was catalogued, every system analyzed and recorded. Venamis remained conscious throughout, forced to observe his own dissection through reflective surfaces positioned around the cell. Plagueis worked with the focused intensity of someone genuinely interested in the subject matter rather than the suffering it caused. He explained procedures as he performed them, lecturing to an audience of 1 about midi-chlorian behavior, cellular regeneration rates, and the physical structures that enabled force sensitivity. The actual experiments began on the 8th day. Plagueis started with midi-chlorian extraction, using techniques Venamis himself had developed but refined to be more efficient. Needles penetrated deep into bone marrow, drawing out samples rich with the microscopic organisms. The pain was extraordinary, a burning sensation that radiated through his entire skeleton. But the containment field prevented screaming, allowed only silent suffering. Each extraction was followed by analysis. Plagueis would study the samples under advanced microscopes, subject them to various stimuli, measure their responses to force energy. He took detailed notes, occasionally making observations aloud about how Venamis's midi-chlorians differed from baseline samples collected from other force sensitives. The 3rd week introduced tissue regeneration experiments. Plagueis would damage specific organs using precisely calibrated force lightning, then attempt to heal them using techniques drawn from both Jedi and Sith traditions. Sometimes the healing worked perfectly, tissue restoring itself within hours. Other times it failed catastrophically, requiring medical droids to intervene before permanent damage occurred. Venamis learned that Plagueis was studying the relationship between midi-chlorians and cellular repair. The Morn believed that understanding this mechanism was key to extending life indefinitely, perhaps even reversing the aging process entirely. Every experiment brought him closer to that goal, and Venamis's body provided ideal test conditions due to his already enhanced physiology. Consciousness transfer experiments began in the second month. These were the most disturbing, involving attempts to separate Venamis's essence from his physical form using dark side techniques. Plagueis would apply specific force energies designed to loosen the connection between body and spirit, testing how far that separation could extend before becoming permanent. The sensation was indescribable. Venamis would feel himself pulled in multiple directions simultaneously, his sense of self fragmenting across dimensions he had no vocabulary to describe. Sometimes he would perceive his body from outside, watching it convulse in the containment field, while his consciousness floated detached. Other times he would experience multiple layers of reality overlapping, past and present bleeding together until he could not distinguish memory from current experience. Plagueis documented everything with scientific detachment. He measured the energy required to achieve various levels of separation. He timed how long consciousness could remain detached before automatically snapping back. He experimented with different force techniques, comparing their effectiveness at achieving stable essence projection. Between experiments, there were conversations. Plagueis would sometimes sit near the containment cell, reviewing data while speaking as if Venamis were a colleague rather than a prisoner. He discussed his theories about immortality, his plans for the Sith, his vision of a galaxy shaped by dark side philosophy rather than Jedi superstition. Death is merely a failure of the midi-chlorians to maintain cellular cohesion. Plagueis explained during one such session, if we can understand why they eventually lose that cohesion, we can develop techniques to prevent it. You are helping achieve that understanding, Venamis. Your suffering has genuine purpose. Venamis tried to respond, tried to argue or plead or curse, but the containment field prevented speech. He could only listen as Plagueis outlined a future where Sith Lords ruled forever, accumulating knowledge across centuries, guiding galactic civilization toward some dark apotheosis only the Moon could envision clearly. The psychological impact grew worse than the physical torture. Venamis had always defined himself through his intellect, his scientific achievements, his ability to solve problems through analysis and experimentation. Now that identity was being systematically dismantled. He was not the scientist but the subject, not the one who understood but the one being understood. Every experiment proved that Plagueis possessed greater knowledge, greater skill, greater power. His mind began fragmenting under the strain. Sometimes he would experience periods where time seemed to stop, hours passing in what felt like seconds. Other times, individual seconds stretched into eternities, each moment of pain amplified beyond endurance. His memories became unreliable, mixing experiences from his imprisonment with events from decades past. He would remember conducting experiments that he had actually been subjected to, or recall Tenebrous teaching him techniques that Plagueis had just demonstrated. Medical droids kept him physically stable, but there was no treatment for the psychological deterioration. Plagueis noted the changes with interest, documenting how extreme suffering affected force sensitivity and midi-chlorian activity. The data suggested that consciousness was more resilient than physical form, able to maintain cohesion even when sensory input became overwhelming. By the 6th month, Venamis had lost most sense of individual identity. The being in the containment field was no longer clearly Venamis, but rather a collection of sensations and fragmentary thoughts held together by biological processes. When Plagueis asked questions during experiments, the responses came automatically, disassociated from any sense of self-preservation or dignity. This dissociation interested Plagueis greatly. He theorized that extreme trauma could separate consciousness from ego, potentially making essence transfer easier by removing psychological attachment to specific physical forms. He designed new experiments to test this hypothesis, pushing Venamis further toward complete ego dissolution while carefully monitoring to prevent permanent damage to consciousness itself. The most significant breakthrough came during the 9th month. Plagueis successfully extracted a portion of Venamis's essence and contained it temporarily in a specially prepared vessel, a cloned tissue sample maintained in stasis. For approximately 17 minutes, Venamis's consciousness existed in two places simultaneously, experiencing both his original body and the cloned tissue. The sensation was profound and terrible. He felt himself stretched across the gap between vessels, awareness divided, but somehow remaining singular. When Plagueis finally released the essence to return to its original body, the snapback was violent enough to cause seizures that required medical intervention to control. But the experiment proved essence transfer was theoretically possible. With refinement, Plagueis might eventually achieve consciousness transplantation between bodies, taking a significant step toward the immortality he sought. Venamis had contributed something genuinely valuable to Sith science, though the cost was his own continued torment. As the first year ended, Plagueis began preparing for more extreme experiments. The baseline data was complete. The preliminary techniques were tested and refined. Now came the truly dangerous procedures, the ones where survival was not guaranteed. Venamis would be killed and resurrected repeatedly, each cycle providing data about the exact mechanisms of death and the limits of force healing. The transition from torture to systematic execution marked a new phase of his imprisonment. What little remained of his identity would be tested to destruction, literally, as Plagueis explored the boundary between life and death. And there was nothing Venamis could do except experience it, his consciousness trapped in a body that had become someone else's laboratory. The first death was drowning. Plagueis flooded the containment cylinder with liquid, forcing it into Venamis's lungs, despite desperate attempts to hold his breath. The panic was instinctive, biological programming, overwhelming conscious thought. His body convulsed, trying to expel the fluid and find air that did not exist. Consciousness faded as oxygen deprivation damaged his brain, darkness closing in from all sides until nothing remained. Then awareness returned, sudden and violent. Venamis gasped, his lungs somehow clear, his body restored to the moment before death. Plagueis stood outside the cylinder taking notes, having used force healing to reverse the damage and restart biological functions. The entire death and resurrection had taken less than 3 minutes. "Interesting," Plagueis murmured. "Your midi-chlorians responded to directed force energy even after brain death occurred. That suggests consciousness is stored in cellular structures rather than neural patterns alone." The second death came hours later, this time from force lightning applied directly to his heart. The organ stopped instantly, blood ceasing to flow, cells beginning immediate necrosis. Death was faster this time, less traumatic but somehow more final feeling. The darkness had weight to it, a sense of slipping away that felt permanent. Until it was not. Plagueis revived him again, the heart restarting under force manipulation, damaged tissue regenerating impossibly fast. Venamis returned to consciousness with the memory of ending fresh in his mind, the certainty of death undermined by continued existence. This became the pattern. Death followed by resurrection, each cycle using different methods, testing different variables. Plagueis varied the time between death and revival, measuring how long consciousness could be restored after biological functions ceased. He experimented with different healing techniques, comparing Jedi methods against Sith approaches. He documented which organs could be regenerated and which required technological support to restore. Venamis died by suffocation, by poison, by having his brain crushed through telekinesis. He died from cellular degradation induced by targeted midi-chlorian destruction. He died from having his blood replaced with saline solution. Each death added to Plagueis's data. Each resurrection proved that the boundary between life and death was less absolute than commonly believed. The psychological impact was devastating in ways physical torture had not been. Venamis's sense of self had already fragmented during the earlier experiments. Now even the certainty of death was taken from him. He could not escape into non-existence because Plagueis would not allow it. Every ending was temporary, every release from suffering reversed. Between deaths, during the hours or sometimes days of recovery, Plagueis would engage him in philosophical discussions. The Milwoon seemed genuinely interested in Venamis's subjective experience of dying and returning, treating these conversations as important data collection rather than mere cruelty. "What do you perceive during the transition?" Plagueis asked, after the seventh resurrection. "Is there continuity of consciousness, or a gap in awareness?" Venamis found himself answering despite no desire to cooperate. The containment field prevented lies, and his fragmented psyche lacked the cohesion to maintain deception anyway. He described the sensation of dissolution, how identity seemed to spread out and lose definition as death approached. He explained the moments of absolute nothing between dying and reviving, gaps where time had no meaning and existence simply stopped. Plagueis absorbed these descriptions hungrily, incorporating them into his theoretical framework about consciousness and the Force. He theorized that midi-chlorians served as storage for identity, containing some essential pattern that allowed consciousness to recohere even after brain death. If that pattern could be extracted and transferred, true immortality might be achievable. The experiments grew more sophisticated. Plagueis began mapping which midi-chlorians remained active during death, identifying specific cellular locations that retained some form of energy signature even after life signs ceased. He discovered that Force-sensitive beings midi-chlorians behaved differently from baseline organisms, maintaining coherence longer and responding more readily to resurrection attempts. By the 20th cycle, Venamis barely registered the deaths as traumatic events. They had become routine, just another unpleasant procedure to endure. His consciousness had adapted, learning to recognize the signs of approaching death and mentally preparing for the temporary discontinuity. Sometimes he welcomed it, the brief gaps of non-existence, offering respite from constant awareness of his captivity. But Plagueis noticed this adaptation and adjusted his approach. He began varying the time between death and revival unpredictably, sometimes bringing Venamis back immediately, other times leaving him dead for hours. The uncertainty was worse than the pain, preventing psychological accommodation to the routine. "You are learning to anticipate patterns," Plagueis observed. "That defeats the purpose. These experiments must maintain genuine threat perception to generate accurate data about survival responses at the cellular level." The conversations during recovery periods took on surreal quality. Plagueis would discuss galactic politics while Venamis's body healed from the latest death. The Moon described his plans to manipulate the Republic Senate, to position specific candidates for election, to gradually shift power towards centralization. He spoke of the Trade Federation and banking clan as tools, economic leverage to be applied at strategic moments. Venamis found himself almost interested despite everything. The scope of Plagueis' planning was impressive, schemes that spanned decades and involved thousands of moving pieces. This was Sith philosophy, applied to civilization itself, shaping the galaxy as methodically as Venamis had once shaped living tissue. Tenebrous believed the Sith should rule through understanding. Plagueis said during one such conversation, he thought mathematical predictions and Force foresight would give us inevitable victory, but he was wrong. The future is not deterministic. It responds to will, to power applied at critical moments. That is why I will succeed where he failed. The cycles continued. 30 deaths, 40, 50. Plagueis documented diminishing returns as Venamis's body adapted to the trauma. Resurrections took longer, required more force energy to achieve. Tissue became scarred at the cellular level, midichlorians less responsive to healing techniques. The experiments were approaching their useful limit. By the 60th cycle, Plagueis had extracted everything of value. He had mapped the death process completely, understood which biological systems failed first and which could be restored last. He had proven that consciousness could survive extended periods of clinical death if sufficient midichlorian activity remained. He had developed techniques for resurrection that worked even on severely damaged bodies. Venamis's physical form was failing despite force intervention. Organs that had been regenerated dozens of times were showing permanent damage. His midichlorian count had dropped significantly, the organisms depleted by constant healing demands. His brain exhibited structural changes consistent with severe trauma, though consciousness somehow persisted. The end was approaching, though neither prisoner nor captor acknowledged it explicitly. Plagueis began making preparations for final procedures, experiments that would destroy Venamis completely, but yield the last remaining data. There would be no resurrection after these. The subject had served his purpose and would be discarded. Venamis understood this on some level beyond conscious thought. The fragment of self that remained, buried beneath layers of trauma and dissociation, recognized that his torment was nearly complete. Soon there would be a final death, one that Plagueis would not reverse, and that death would be mercy. The final experiment was ambitious. Plagueis intended to keep Venamis dead for an extended period, far longer than previous attempts, then attempt resurrection using techniques that theoretically could restore consciousness even after complete cellular breakdown. If successful, it would prove that death was truly reversible under any circumstances given sufficient force mastery. The method chosen was systematic organ failure induced through precisely calibrated force attacks. Plagueis worked through Venamis's body methodically, shutting down each system in sequence, monitoring the cascade effects, documenting how long each organ could survive after its support systems failed. Venamis felt his body dying piece by piece, awareness fading incrementally rather than all at once. His kidneys failed first, toxins building in his blood. His liver stopped processing chemicals, adding to the systemic poisoning. His heart continued beating but without purpose, circulating contaminated fluid through failing tissue. Finally, his brain lost oxygen, neurons firing randomly as death approached. This time the darkness felt different, permanent. Venamis's consciousness dissolved into it completely, no sense of self remaining, just the absolute nothing he had experienced in previous cycles, but extending indefinitely. There was no perception of time passing, no awareness of anything at all. He simply stopped existing in any meaningful sense. Plagueis let him remain dead for 6 hours, longer than any previous attempt. Medical monitors showed zero brain activity, no heartbeat, cellular necrosis beginning throughout the body. By conventional definitions, Venamis was as dead as anyone could be. Then Plagueis began the resurrection attempt. He poured force energy into the corpse, targeting the midichlorians specifically, trying to restart their activity and use them as foundation for broader healing. For the first hour, nothing happened. The body remained inert, unresponsive to even the most powerful healing techniques. But Plagueis persisted, adjusting his approach, trying variations on standard methods. He drew on dark side energy, using pain and suffering from previous subjects as fuel. He applied ancient Sith techniques described in holocrons thousands of years old. He combined technological support with force manipulation, medical droids working alongside his own power. Slowly, impossibly, something responded. A few midichlorians showed activity. then more, a cascade effect as dormant organisms reactivated and began influencing surrounding cells. Tissue started regenerating, organs repairing damage that should have been irreversible. The heart twitched once, twice, then began beating regularly. But consciousness did not return. Venamis's body was alive in technical sense, biological functions restored and stable, but the awareness that had once inhabited it was gone, dispersed beyond recovery. Whatever pattern the midi-chlorians had contained was damaged beyond repair by the extended death period. Plagueis studied the living corpse for 3 days, running tests, trying various techniques to restore consciousness. Nothing worked. The body breathed and maintained homeostasis, but no one was home. Venamis was truly, finally dead, in the only way that mattered. The Moon terminated life support and allowed the body to expire naturally. This time, there would be no resurrection. The experiment was complete. The data collected, the subject exhausted. Medical droids disposed of the corpse through incineration, leaving nothing behind but ashes and recorded observations. Plagueis reviewed his notes, synthesizing 3 years of experimentation into coherent conclusions. Venamis had provided invaluable data about midi-chlorian behavior, consciousness storage, and the mechanisms of death. The techniques developed through his suffering would advance Sith science significantly, bringing Plagueis closer to his goal of immortality. But the primary lesson was about limits. Even with complete understanding of biological processes and unlimited force power, some boundaries could not be crossed. Consciousness could be preserved after death, but only briefly. Extended death caused irreversible damage to whatever stored identity within midi-chlorians. True immortality would require preventing death entirely rather than reversing it after the fact. Plagueis filed his research in encrypted archives and moved on to other projects. Within weeks he had largely forgotten about Venamis. Except as a source of useful data, the Bith's existence had been validated, his contribution to Sith knowledge acknowledged, his suffering given purpose within the larger scheme. Years later, Plagueis would apply lessons learned from Venamis to his own survival, using force healing to extend his life far beyond natural limits. He would teach a portion of this knowledge to his apprentice Sidious, who would in turn use it to sustain himself through injuries that should have been fatal. The chain of knowledge continued, each link built partially on Venamis's unwilling sacrifice. But the Bith himself was forgotten. No records mentioned his name, except in Plagueis's private files. No Sith Lord remembered him as anything more than a failed contingency. Tenebrus's backup plan that had been eliminated when no longer needed. His laboratories were eventually discovered by salvage crews who had no idea what experiments had been conducted there. Venamis's legacy existed only in techniques stolen by Plagueis and refined beyond their creator's capabilities. The midi-chlorian manipulation methods he pioneered would influence how Sidious approached creating life, how he attempted to cheat death, how he viewed the Force as something to be controlled rather than respected. Decades after his death, Venamis's research would contribute to some of the Empire's darkest projects. But no one would know. No one would remember. He had wanted recognition, had challenged Plagueis partially for the title, but more fundamentally for acknowledgement of his worth. Instead, he received the opposite. His name erased, his achievements stolen, his existence reduced to data points in someone else's research. The galaxy continued unchanged by his passing. Stars burned in their courses. Civilizations rose and fell. The Sith prepared their 1,000-year plan, and somewhere in the ashes scattered on a remote planet, Darth Venamis ceased to matter in any way that history would record. His story ended not with epic confrontation or meaningful sacrifice, but with simple disposal, a used resource discarded when exhausted. It was perhaps the most Sith ending possible, proof that their philosophy valued results over individuals, power over sentiment, victory over mercy. Venamis had believed himself special, chosen, destined for greatness. He died learning that he had been ordinary all along, just another ambitious being destroyed by reaching beyond his capabilities. The lesson was complete, the punishment was absolute, and the memory was deliberately forgotten. Decades passed. The galaxy spun through its ancient patterns, stars being born and dying in distant nebulae, civilizations rising on forgotten worlds, while others crumbled into dust. The Republic continued its slow march toward the crisis that would transform it into empire, senators debating legislation while shadows moved beneath their deliberations, orchestrating events they could not perceive. On an unnamed moon in the Outer Rim, Venamis's primary laboratory stood empty. The ice storms that ravaged the surface had broken through sealed doors, filling corridors with frost and silence. Containment tanks that once held his experimental subjects were shattered or dark, their contents long since expired or escaped. Equipment that had cost fortunes sat frozen and useless, technological marvels rendered meaningless by abandonment. Eventually salvage crews would find the facility. They would catalog the strange equipment, puzzle over the purpose of chambers designed for purposes they could not imagine, and ultimately strip everything of value before moving on to more profitable sites. None of them would understand what had been created there, what suffering those sterile walls had witnessed, what ambitions had driven their construction. Venamis's name appeared nowhere in galactic records. The Republic had never known he existed. The Jedi, who maintained careful watch for dark side activity, had somehow missed his decades of experimentation. Even criminal organizations that had profited from his services could not have identified him, having dealt only with intermediaries and shell corporations. He had achieved the anonymity the Sith prized, but it was the wrong kind, erasure rather than deliberate concealment. Yet his influence persisted in ways he never could have anticipated. The techniques Plagueis had refined through torturing him became foundational to the Moon's later work. When Plagueis successfully manipulated midi-chlorians to influence the creation of life, he built on principles first explored in Venamis's laboratories. When he taught his apprentice Sidious about cheating death, he shared knowledge purchased with Venamis's suffering. Sidious would take those lessons and push them further. As Emperor Palpatine, he would fund Project Necromancer and other attempts at immortality through cloning and essence transfer. He would create the Inquisitorius, force-sensitive agents enhanced and conditioned in ways that echoed Venamis's Chosen. He would experiment on force-sensitive children, seeking to understand and control the source of their power. All of it traced back, in part, to a Bith scientist who had died forgotten in Plagueis's laboratory. The irony would have devastated Venamis if he could have known. His research did change the galaxy, did influence the Sith's ultimate victory over the Jedi and Republic, but he received no credit, no recognition, no acknowledgement that his work mattered. He was a ghost in the machine, his contributions erased while his methods lived on in twisted form. The greater tragedy was not his death, but his corruption. Before Tenebrous found him on Clactor 7th, Venamis had been a legitimate scientist with genuine curiosity about the universe. He had asked meaningful questions about life and consciousness, sought understanding rather than power. The dark side had taken that curiosity and twisted it, transformed noble inquiry into torture disguised as research, turned someone who might have helped the galaxy into someone who only harmed it. This was the Sith's true victory, not in destroying their enemies, but in corrupting those with potential and redirecting that potential toward suffering. How many beings like Venamis existed across galactic history? People with gifts who might have achieved greatness, but instead were consumed by darkness. The count was unknowable, the waste immeasurable. On Coruscant, in chambers beneath the Senate building, Darth Sidious meditated on the future. He was decades away from declaring himself emperor, still playing the role of humble senator, but the plans were already in motion. Clone armies were being commissioned. The Jedi were being maneuvered into positions where they could be eliminated efficiently. And in his private laboratories, experiments continued that would have horrified the Republic had they known. Sometimes, rarely, Sidious would review Plagueis's research notes and encounter references to the Bith test subject. The data was useful, the techniques sound, but Sidious gave no thought to the person behind the data. Venamis was just one more resource the Sith had exploited in their patient climb to dominance. His individuality meant nothing. Only his contribution to the larger plan mattered. The rule of two demanded this ruthlessness. Sentiment was weakness. Attachment was failure. Every Sith Lord stood on a foundation of bones, their power built through sacrificing anyone and everyone who served the Order's interests. Venamis had joined that foundation, his bones literal and metaphorical, supporting a structure he had wanted to lead but could only serve through destruction. The cosmic perspective made individual suffering seem small. What was one Bith's torment measured against the turning of galaxies? What did decades of experimentation matter when stars burned for billions of years? The Force itself was indifferent, flowing through all things without judgment, empowering both creation and destruction equally. Yet that indifference was not quite complete. The Force remembered, in its own way, every act committed through its power. Venamis's suffering had left echoes, disturbances in the cosmic fabric that might never fully heal. Sensitive beings visiting his abandoned laboratories decades later would report feeling watched, sensing emotions that had no source, experiencing visions of procedures they could not possibly know about. These echoes were not ghosts in any traditional sense. Venamis's consciousness had truly ended, dissolved beyond recovery. But pain that intense, repeated that many times, impressed itself into the environment at a level deeper than physical matter. The dark side fed on suffering, and Venamis had provided a feast that would sustain ripples for generations. In the end, his story became a cautionary tale that no one heard. A warning about ambition divorced from wisdom, power sought without understanding its cost, and the Sith philosophy's terrible efficiency at consuming those who served it. The lessons were profound but useless because no record existed to teach them. The galaxy drifted toward its great crisis, the moment when thousands of years of Sith planning would finally bear fruit. The Jedi would be destroyed. The Republic would become Empire. Darkness would reign for decades until a moisture farmer from Tatooine ignited a rebellion that would restore balance, though at tremendous cost. Through all of this, through the Clone Wars and the Imperial era, and the eventual redemption of Anakin Skywalker, Venamis's contribution remained invisible. His techniques enabled horrors, but also indirectly influenced the knowledge that would eventually help defeat the Sith. The chain of cause and effect was too complex to trace clearly, but his suffering had consequences that rippled across decades. On distant worlds far from galactic politics, simple beings lived their lives unaware of Sith or Jedi, of empires or republics. They loved and struggled and died in patterns unchanged for millennia. Their stories mattered to them completely and to history not at all. In this they were like Venamis, individuals whose significance existed only in the moment before being consumed by the vastness of time and space. The stars continued their patient burning. Nebulae collapsed into new solar systems. Black holes devoured matter and energy at the hearts of galaxies. And through all of this cosmic activity, the Force flowed eternal and mysterious, connecting all things while belonging to none, empowering both light and darkness in an endless dance that predated civilization and would continue long after the last sentient being drew their final breath. Venamis had sought to understand the Force, to quantify and control it through scientific method. His failure was not in the attempt but in forgetting that some mysteries resist analysis, that power without wisdom leads only to destruction. The Force could not be conquered or owned. It could only be experienced, channeled, and ultimately surrendered to when the time came. His laboratories crumbled slowly under ice and time. His research, stolen and refined by others, contributed to advances he never imagined and atrocities he might not have endorsed despite his own crimes. His name faded from even the secret histories the Sith maintained, and the universe, vast and indifferent, rolled onward. This is where stories end, when they are forgotten. Not with dramatic finality, but with gradual dissolution, memories fading into silence, significance eroding, until nothing remains but dust and distant echoes. Venamis achieved his kind of immortality, after all, not through consciousness preserved, but through consequences that outlived him, ripples spreading across decades from a stone thrown into darkness. The tale is complete. The tragedy has run its course. And in the quiet spaces between stars, where light takes centuries to travel and silence is absolute, perhaps there is peace. If you found meaning in this forgotten chapter of galactic history, consider subscribing to journey deeper into the mysteries that shaped the Star Wars universe. There are countless stories waiting to be told, shadows that have never seen light, tragedies that deserve remembering even if the galaxy has forgotten them. Rest now. Let the weight of this story settle into understanding. Sleep comes easier when we know the endings, even the dark ones, and find peace in completion. The Force surrounds us, binds us, and ultimately returns us all to the cosmic ocean from which we emerged. May your rest be dreamless and deep,